Hello again. In the previous episode, we created a function that rewards the player with bonus score. In this episode, we will create a power-up mechanism that gives the player temporary invincibility. Let's start by setting up the power-up game object. Duplicate the original pickup and rename it as Powerup. Change the sprite to pickups_3 and give it a highest score value of your choice. I will set the value to 50. Then we need to give it a new tag. Create a tag called Powerup and assign it to this game object. Lastly, drag the Powerup to the prefabs folder. This time choose Original Prefab. Next, open the player script. First of all, we need to create a variable that tells us if the Powerup is activated. Write public bool Powerup activated. Then we need a variable that serves as a timer for the Powerup effect. Write public float Powerup timer. Then set the boolean to false and the timer to 0 in start function. Let's create the function next. Head to the bottom of our script. Under the bonus score function, write void Powerup. We will first create the mechanism and add some nice effects later. So, we want this function to do something when the Powerup is active. Write if Powerup activated. Next, we will activate our timer. Write Powerup timer plus equals to time dot delta time. Then we need to define the length of the Powerup effect, and after it has expired, set the boolean to false and the timer to 0. Write if Powerup timer greater than sign 10f. And inside of the curly brackets, Powerup activated equals to false and under it, Powerup timer equals to 0f. This effect will last for 10 seconds and then it is disabled. You can later tweak the values according to your wishes. This function is not called anywhere yet. Let's go to update function and call this function there. Write Powerup parenthesis and semicolon. Next, we need to think where to set the Powerup boolean to true. When we collect the Powerup, which means we need to make a new case inside of the switch statement. Write case Powerup. Then set the boolean to true. After that, copy the code from pickups case and paste it under the boolean. And finally, write break and semicolon at the end. We can copy the code from pickups case because the Powerup has the same script attached and we want to include it in the bonus calculation as well. Okay, now the function will work, but there is no effect on the gameplay yet. Let's start making some. Go to the case for enemy and add a second condition to the if statement. Write 2 ampersands, exclamation mark, and Powerup activated. Now the player will die only if the power-up is not active. We need to add this condition to the collision with projectile as well. Write 2 ampersands, exclamation mark, and power-up activated. We forgot to add the is dead condition in the previous episode to prevent the player from receiving bonus after death. So let's do it now. Write 2 ampersands, exclamation mark, and is dead. Next, we will make one improvement to the game over mechanics. Save the script and return to Unity. Open Level 2 scene. Here, in the hierarchy, we should see a game object called Boundary. We created it during the first Unity Basics course to activate the game over state if the player falls down. The problem is that its tag is enemy, and while the power-up is active, the player can fall through this trigger area into eternity without dying. So let's give it a new tag and separate it in the code so that the power-up effect doesn't concern it. Create a tag called Boundary and assign it to the game object. Then drag the Boundary game object to the prefabs folder so that it can be easily used in other levels as well. Let's get back to the player script. We need to make a new case for this. Under the enemy's case, write case boundary. Then copy the block of code from enemy's case and paste it here. We will add one extra line here to disable the physics simulation from the player's rigid body so that the player stops at the boundary. Write rb.simulated equals to false. Let's save the script and test our power-up in action. Open the level 3 scene and activate play mode. Great, it works! The enemy can't destroy us, and neither can the projectiles. Alright, now the mechanics are working. Next, we will add some UI graphics to display the duration of the power-up so that the player knows how long the effect lasts. Switch to Game View. Then, right-click in Hierarchy and select UI Slider. Rename it as Power-Up Slider. After that, we need to anchor the slider properly. Go to Anchor Presets, hold down Shift and Alt, and choose the top middle anchor point. Then, change the scale to 2 on all axes and position Y to -20. Next, we need to make the slider functional. Open the UI controller script. Let's start by defining a variable for the slider. Write public slider power-up slider. The UI elements are also types, so that's why we can define this variable as slider. Then, in start function, we need to get it out of sight. Write power-up slider dot gameObject dot setActive false. When should we enable the slider then? In the player script, we have the power-up activated variable, which tells when the effect is active. So, in the update function, write if player.powerup activated and inside of the curly brackets, powerup slider dot game object dot set active true. Then we need to make sure it is disabled after the time has passed. Write else, curly brackets, and inside of them, powerup slider dot game object dot set active false. Now the slider will be enabled and disabled correctly. But the slider bar itself is still. When we take a look at the slider component, we see this value slider at the bottom. If we drag it around, also the slider bar in game view moves. We need to refer to this in code. So let's get back there. Inside of the if statement, write powerup slider dot value equals to player dot powerup timer. Now the slider will move according to the time the effect has been active. Save the script and return to Unity. Select UI and drag the slider to the correct variable slot. Then hit play. The slider works, but not perfectly. Exit play mode. Select the slider. When we take a deeper look at the slider component, we see these two fields here which define the minimum and maximum values for the slider. Since the max value is 1, the slider gets filled after 1 second, whereas our power-up effect lasts for 10 seconds. Let's increase the max value to 10. Enter play mode again. Great, now the slider works properly. There is still one little thing though. The slider starts from the empty state and proceeds towards the full state. It would be more logical if it started from the full state and proceeded towards the empty state. Our timer is calculating time from 0 to 10 seconds, which means its direction is always from minimum to maximum. We would need the value to go from maximum to minimum. Note that changing the direction from the drop-down menu doesn't solve this. It just rotates the slider, but the problem is the same. The solution to this is quite simple. We will invert the times value so that it moves from 0 to -10. Let's get back to UI controller script. What we need to do is to add a minus before player.powerup timer. When you're done, save the script and get back to Unity. Then we need to change the max value to 0 and min value to -10. When it's done, enter play mode. Awesome! Now the slider works perfectly. Final thing to do is to select the UI game object and to apply the changes to the prefab. Great! We are done for this episode. Now we have a working power-up effect and also a UI slider to inform the player. However, the power-up itself is quite boring for the moment. There is nothing else happening than the slider popping up. We will change that next. In the next episode, we will use a particle system to create a cool effect on the player while the power-up is active. Remember to save the scene. See you later.